What's your full name?
Well, my mother called me Joseph Norman, but I wasn't happy with that. I like the word Jack. I've gone by Jack all my life.
Where are you from originally?
I was born in a small town by the name of Gunter, 15 miles from Dallas. But 1 year later, my father moved to a small town 56 miles south of Wichita Falls. He was a farmer, and that's where I grew up, with the cotton and corn and barley and all that hard labor.
Sure enough.
Hard labor, no money.
That makes it harder.
Yeah.
And you were there until...
18 years old, April 24, 1940, I joined the Navy. I was finally able to convince my mother to sign the papers. That took a while. But that's what I wanted. And my father was a World War II, World War I Army veteran. And he didn't have any say in it. He just sat back and let me do what I wanted because he knew that's what I wanted, so he didn't verse his opinion.
He probably didn't think it would do much good.
No.
Did you have any siblings?
No siblings.
Okay. And so take me through your Navy career from joining up until...
Okay, well, like I said, I joined in April 1924. Got aboard the train in Dallas for my trip to San Diego. I was arriving in San Diego, North Island. I was immediately taken to the Naval Training Station. The doctor examined me, got all my clothes, all this stuff. And it so happened that the last job I had prior to joining the Navy, I was cutting prickly pears with a long-handled shovel, piling the prickly pears so they could dry and burn them so the cattle couldn't eat them. I had calluses on my hands you couldn't believe. The doctor looked at them, he said, "What in the hell have you been doing?" He then told me I had appendicitis. I went to the Naval Hospital, spent a month. Of course, it's an overnight procedure now, I guess, but I spent a month there. At any rate, after the month, I went to boot camp for 2 months. I still remember our chief petty officer that was in charge of our company. I'll never forget him. His name was Sartorius. Navy the boot camp is pretty strenuous, but it's certainly necessary. It changes a boy into a man. You march all day, box, swim, study portraits, study your silhouettes and everything. At night, you wash your own clothes, hang them up on a line they better be tied with the right type of knot or you'll pay for it the next day. I only made one mistake. Anyway, one day we're lined up on a drill field, and Sartorius says, there's a tendency for a young recruit in the Navy to square up his white hat so he looks salty. We're all lined up, and he says, "Okay, sailors," he says, "I want you to round out those white hats." He says, "I know some of you are pretty salty, but most of you still smell from cow shit." At any rate, I finished that, and I went through 4 months of aviation machinist mate schooling. December the 6th, I boarded the USS Platte, a U.S. Navy sea tanker, loaded with 6 million gallons of fuel oil. We arrived in Pearl Harbor on December the 12th. I was immediately taken to VP-23, a PBY squadron based on Fort Island. I was far from becoming a crew member on a PBY. The PBYs, you know, didn't have fixed landing gear. They had what they call beaching gear. That was part of my job for 4 months. Installing the beaching gear on the aircraft and remove it when they came back after a flight. After 4 months, I was assigned to a plane crew as a waist hatch gunner and the first mechanic. 4 months later, I became a plane captain. Hawaii was a great duty until Yamamoto arrived. I had the duty that day, and my section had just fell in for muster when the section leader began roll call. We heard a screaming aircraft, and moments later, a terrible explosion. We ran outside and seen the hangar beside us, VP-1s, receive the first bomb that fell at Pearl Harbor.
Wow.
But our aircraft, 12 aircraft, incidentally, they were only 2 weeks old. We just returned from San Diego with brand new PBYs. Half of them were on fire. It so happened that one of my shipmates remembered there's a sewer line behind our hangar under construction. He says, let's go for the ditch, follow me. We all ran, jumped in the ditch, sat there clinging to each other. And one of the pilots seen us, circled, strafed the ditch with machine gun fire, and he missed us for probably 3 feet. He hit the dirt piled up beside the ditch.
Oh, my goodness.
This was a two-way attack, of course. I don't know how long we were in the ditch, but when we finished the first attack, we came out. And I forgot to mention, when we first came out of the hangar, I seen all these aircraft circling with the rising sun and saying, you know, I knew exactly what had happened, or we did. Mm-hmm. And people have asked me, you know, what my thoughts were at that time. And we had so many, it's hard to describe. Anger, surprise, fear, whatever. And also, from our ramp where we dispatched the aircraft and brought them in, we could look up the bay and see the battleship row. Mm-hmm. I seen the Arizona, the Nevada, West Virginia, Tennessee, California, Utah, all on fire. I've seen the Arizona sinking, of course. I also seen seamen jumping in the water, in oil-burning water. Some of them died in the water. Some of them died when they hit the beach. Some of them made it. Martial law was declared immediately after the war started. A complete blackout was called, and machine gun pits built from sandbags was set up all around Fort Island. I had the pleasure, along with 2 shipmates, to man one of them for 3 days and nights. We had no idea where the Japanese fleet were or if they planned on returning, but every ship noise or every aircraft noise we heard, we knew they were coming back. Fortunately, that didn't happen. On the 4th day, we were allowed to return to our barracks. All lockers had been broken open to retrieve white clothing for bandages. Mm-hmm. And we were given, at that time, a postcard with 2 inscribed inscriptions. The first one says, I've been wounded. The second says, I'm okay, don't worry. That's all we could say. My mother received this card 11 days later. Wow. When I seen my father sometime later, He said my mother was hysterical during the time, and she got on her knees and prayed to God if he would save her son, she'd spend the rest of her life working for the church, and she did.
How about that?
Of course, we returned to normal duty following December the 7th. But following, well, I might say that immediately after the war started, FDR called his military staff together and says, I want you to devise a plan to strike Tokyo. He was told, Mr. President, this is an impossibility. We don't have any aircraft with that capability. He managed to get up out of his chair, and he says, you know, some time ago, I was pretty active. I did a lot of swimming, played tennis, and he says, I've often wondered why God put me in this chair. He says, now I know I can look into the eyes of my military and see defeat. He said, now don't tell me it's impossible. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle was called and told to put together a group of capable flyers and start training in the B-25 on very short takeoffs and landings. He lined up a group and he says, gentlemen, we're going on a mission where I can't tell you where it is, but we're going on a mission that you probably won't return. If you still want to go, please step forward. Every man did. April the 2nd, they were moved aboard the Hornet, and they were then told their mission was to bomb Tokyo. On the way to Tokyo, but 650 miles, on April 18th, on the way to Tokyo, but 650 miles short of Tokyo and 250 miles short of their planned launching point, they were spotted by a Japanese fishing boat. Admiral Halsey on the Enterprise, he says, I know our position has been reported, so he turned both ships into the wind and flank speed launched 16 B-25s. Jimmy Doolittle told his men, he says, you know, he says, you better have your aircraft flying in 557 feet. If it takes 558, you'll be dead. That's the length of the runway. At any rate, they all reached their target, hit their targets, but of the 80 men, 8 didn't survive. 1 died when he bailed out of the aircraft, 2 died in a crash, 6 were captured, 3 were executed.
555. Jeff, 555.
Okay.
Any rate, immediately after the raid, our naval intelligence began receiving numerous coded messages using the letters AF and AO. We had broken the Japanese code to a point. We knew what AF and AO meant, but we didn't know. We knew one of them stood for the Aleutian Islands and one Midway, but we didn't know which. Chief of Intelligence told Nimitz, he says, I've come up with a plan to ascertain which one is which. He said, we'll send out an uncoded message saying, Midway has just had a freshwater condenser failure. Nimitz said, send it. The Japanese took the bait. They sent out a coded message saying, AF has just had a freshwater condenser failure. We then knew what it meant, but we didn't know what their plans were, whether they intended to strike the Aleutian Islands or Midway. Nimitz thought it would be Midway. He then sent a small task force into guys to the Aleutians. The Japanese took the bait again. Yamamoto says, the U.S. forces are moving to the Aleutian Islands. We'll now take Midway. Nimitz then dispatched the rest of the fleet to Midway, positioning the carriers in one spot, the rest of the fleet in another. My squadron, VP-23, left Midway April 28, began the search for the fleet. June the 3rd, we found them 450 miles northeast of Midway, headed towards Midway under a weather front. We reported their mission, or their position, and went back to Midway. June the 4th, they hit, of course. It so happened that the Marines on Midway were armed with 27 Brewster Buffalo fighters. They sent 27 aloft. Only 7 come back, and they were badly damaged. For the first 2 hours, we were definitely losing the battle. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was the leader of a dive bombing squad made up of 3 squadrons. They'd been airborne 2 hours, running low on fuel. We had already reported the Japanese fleet position, but Nagumo changed directions, and our dive bombers couldn't find him. McCluskey says, okay, we're going to press on just a little longer. And just moments later, he's seen the white wake of a fast-moving destroyer, and he says, that ship has to be racing to reach the main Japanese force. He says, we'll follow it. And moments later they did. They found 3 aircraft carriers. Diving from 20,000 feet, they sunk 3 aircraft carriers in 4 minutes. They were aided by 2 factors. Japanese fighters were at low altitude protecting their own ships from our torpedo planes, and Nagumo had received word that damage to Midway was slight. He says, we'll arm with bombs and go back to Midway. Yamamoto says, no, we'll arm with torpedoes and go after their fleet. While they were rearming, it's when our dive bomber struck. The admiral relieved Admiral Halsey on the Enterprise, called Nimitz, and he says, Admiral, we've had a great day. We just sunk 3 aircraft carriers. Do you think that's enough? He said, hell no, I want the 4th one. The Hiru, which was the 4th, was found 2 hours later and was also sunk. I flew 13 hours that day, armed with 4 500-pound bombs. Early in the afternoon, we struck gold. We caught a Japanese torpedo submarine. I'll get it right in a minute. Surfaced, all hatches were closed, no one was on deck. We dropped 2 bombs, one on the fantail and one right behind the conning tower. We made 6 circles around it, watching it sink. We had a good day. Later in the afternoon, we had lost all contact with Midway. We didn't know if we still held the Midway or the Japanese had it. We could take a chance on returning to Midway, or we could sit down at sea. We dropped our remaining bombs unarmed, sat down at sea, and drifted all night. I took a sleeping bag, climbed on top of the wing, tied myself to an antenna, and spent the night. Sun up, we finally made contact with Midway. We learned that we had been successful. We also were told that there was a destroyer at the French frigate Shoals loaded with aviation fuel. We took sun shots, found our position, flew to the shoals, refueled, went to Midway. The next day, all seaplanes were out searching for downed seamen. Late in the afternoon, we found two gentlemen on a raft, but we were low on fuel at the time. We radioed a sister ship. They landed, picked the two men up, took them to Midway. The next day, we returned to Pearl Harbor. Had 5 glorious days at Royal Hawaiian Hotel. But that was short-lived. July the 2nd, we were at Guadalcanal. Our first stop was Noumea, New Caledonia, where we based in the bay, and we was tending off the seaplane tender, the Curtis, but flying patrol over Guadalcanal to all the Solomon Islands. We reported many shipping incidents there. And actually, when we first arrived there, we were definitely losing that battle. Admiral McGormley was the gentleman in charge of all the forces, but he had never even been on the island of Guadalcanal. He was immediately relieved by Admiral Halsey. Halsey come aboard the Curtis, shook hands with every crew member, immediately moved our aircraft to Espiritu Santo, which was 300 miles closer to Guadalcanal. He then went to Guadalcanal, visited every unit on the island, and he says, we'll no longer allow the troops, the Japs, to call the shots. He says, we'll kill every son of a bitch on this island, and I'll be right there with you. In early 1943, I received orders to travel back to Honolulu, and from there proceed to San Diego, supposedly to help commission a new PBY squadron and return to the Pacific. When I reached San Diego, my orders had been changed. I started training in the B-24 Liberator, spent 2 months there, moved to Argentia, Newfoundland for another 2 months of training. April 1943, I was in Duxville, Devonshire, spent 15 months there, flew 15 missions of anti-submarine patrol over the English Channel and the Bay of Biscay, which is the western coast of France. Most people didn't know that, never knew that the Navy had B-24s, but 5 squadrons were commissioned. I was in the first squadron, VB-103. We had 5 squadrons, as I said, which flew 6,364 missions over the channel, sunk 8 submarines, and damaged 4 more. I managed to get credit for 1 of them. In early June, I received orders to travel to Chincoteague, Virginia, again to help commission a new B-24 squadron. But the war was dwindling down then. The squadron was never commissioned, but I spent a year there as plane captain. 45, I was transferred to Pensacola, Florida, to a PB-4Y2 squadron, which was the Navy's version of the B-24. Spent a year there, was transferred to Patuxent River, Maryland, spent over a year there in the R-5D, which had commercial life as a DC-4. In March of 1948, I received my discharge papers. Moved to Dallas.
And, well, that's fantastic. I know.
Well, I went to work for Braniff as a mechanic.
Oh,
I
yeah.
also went to school and got my my civilian flight engineer's rating.
Yeah.
1950, I moved to Los Angeles, went to work for Northrop Aircraft, spent 3 months there at the Hawthorne Field, which is about 3 miles from the main airport. I looked across the runway one morning, and I seen 2 Braniff DC-4s sitting there, still had the Braniff insignia on them. I said, boy, I've got to go find out what's going on there. I went over, and I met this gentleman by the name of Kirk Krikorin, who was the owner of the airline. I was immediately hired as a flight engineer. 3 months later, Kirk put out an order to the flight engineers that we had to get a pilot's rating and an instrument rating so we could double as co-pilots. I had neither one. So I rushed out, bought a small aircraft, started training. 6 months later, I had a pilot's rating and an instrument rating. I went back to work as a co-pilot, spent 7 years there. One morning, Kirk's secretary called me. She said, Jack, we better start looking for a job. Kirk just sold all the aircraft. I immediately went to work for Union Oil Company of California as a co-pilot and as a corporate pilot. 1 year later, I had my I'm getting tired. I had my pilot's rating for a captain. I spent 10 years there flying as a captain for Union Oil Company of California.
Yeah.
My wife finally wanted me to give up flying. I did. And I went to work for Allied Signal, which is now Honeywell. Spent 20 years there. Retired from there in December 1991. Since then, I played a lot of golf.
That's what I've heard. You're still playing golf, aren't you?
Yes,
That's very good.
not as well, but